when I went to his office, I asked him if he was leaving. He said, yes. I said, can I ask why? And he pointed up at the ceilings and he whispered to me, cameras, because the cameras were everywhere and sometimes you didn't know where they were.
Corporate fraud works best in the shadows, behind corporate walls. How does the government bring these wrongdoers to justice? Whistleblowers. These are the stories of those who risk their careers to shine a light on allegations of fraud. Today on Fraud in America.
George and Dave, I'm really appreciative of you guys joining us today. I've been looking forward to this for a long time. I think that we originally talked about doing this maybe a year ago. So George, I really appreciate you especially taking time today to let us sit down and talk through what I think is perhaps one of the most disturbing cases that have crossed our desk in a long time. So I thank you to both of you guys for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me.
So, George, I'd like to start with you. You were in the healthcare industry for 30 years. So why did you gravitate towards the healthcare world originally?
I was in healthcare long, or at least exposed to healthcare long before my working years. I lived right across the street from the then largest healthcare system in Michigan. And what attracted me initially was family. I had a father that began and ended his career in the healthcare industry, and I had an extended family that worked there. And as I grew older, I took summer roles. Instead of having a summer vacation, I would then work in the hospital in roles such as construction when they were building a new wing, or the next year I would work in the pathology laboratory. The next year I'd work in the blood bank. And I think I took away from those experiences how diverse healthcare was, and that you didn't have to pass meds on the floor to be a part of the healthcare system and have positions there that had both a purpose and was needed. It also made interesting dinner conversations because my siblings worked there too. So in a sense, it became a second home for me.
So you did a bunch of different roles in healthcare, and eventually you found your way into becoming an office manager of a large practice. And a lot of people may not know this. The office manager is kind of the CEO or the COO of a lot of practices, and they keep the trains running on time financially. This brings us up to a point. September of 2011. You were hired by Michigan Hematology Oncology to be their office manager. Can you describe the practice at that time? What was it like? What was the practice like? The facilities at this time?
It was very interesting because, I was offered the job after an interview, and the interview wasn't long. It was maybe somewhere around half an hour, and I was offered the job on the spot, which never happens. I mean, usually there are 200, 300, 400 people that apply for a job, and at least at that time. And Dr. Fata and his wife both conducted the interview, and then they said, okay, will you take the job? And I was shocked when I went to the parking lot and said, what just happened? But, to look at the facilities and understand better, he had at that time 4 offices, one of which was in a facility that you would never consider as a medical office building of any kind. It looked like, I don't know if you remember The Shining, the Overlook Hotel. It was set upon, a mountainside.
Sure.
And even when somebody would tell you, you'd say, that's a medical facility? It looked like some kind of posh hotel. So when you go through the front door, you had a grand piano in the waiting room, artwork on the wall. And when you go into, let's say, Dr. Fata's offices, were like 10,000 square feet. You had, what you would normally see in offices, billing areas for consultations, just many more than the average office. And then, of course, then you walk into the treatment areas. And that's what really stuns you, because the treatment areas where all the chemotherapy and other therapies were performed seemed to be an endless supply of chemotherapy chairs. They're by themselves, they're in couples, they're in quads, they're in rooms by themselves. It just seemed to go on. And as far as the eye could see, there were chemo chairs. So the first thing you think of when you walk in there is, this is a significant role. This is I mean, how am I going to do this? I actually thought I wouldn't last a week here. But I didn't think I would because of the size. I came from the largest healthcare system where I was managing their business development. And that center paled in comparison, both in the number of patients and the volume. The only clinic in the country that could actually compare in volume is the Mayo Clinic. And here it is. Mayo Clinic had 22 doctors in one center. Dr. Fata did it on his own. So that kind of gives you an idea of the scope and the volume and the size of the operation that he had. And the irony is that he grew to all of this, not over 10 years or 20 years over the span of his career, but he grew to this in just a few short years.
Wow. Unbelievable. Well, at this time, what was the reputation of Dr. Fata amongst the patients? And I guess amongst the medical community?
Think of yourself as a patient that may have been newly diagnosed or suspect of having some sort of, hematological or oncology diagnosis at some point. And then I'm going to look up a physician. And you look and you see Dr. Fata appear, and he has this Ivy League education. And to speak to your question, he was voted by his peers for several years as the top doc. And that tended to reinforce his reputation with the patients. So that, coupled with the fact that here's this guy with this stellar reputation and awards, and he'll see you the same day. So if you call it at 1:00, chances are by 3, you can come into his office, where if you go to a hospital, they may wait a month or 2 just to see you for the first time as a new patient. So that in many ways contributed to his growth.
As the office manager, I'm sure your interaction was different than the patient's interaction with Dr. Fata.
Well, there's kind of 2 ways to look at it, both from how he wanted to run his practice just from a policy perspective, and then an interpersonal basis. He was a very controlling person, and it manifested itself by having, the need to have people compartmentalized, have the people in the right places and saying the right things and being focused on your job and nothing else. And he enforced that through the use of cameras and microphones that were placed, in his view, in sensitive areas like the chemo mixing area, billing area, front desk, pretty much everywhere in the building. And he had his cell phone, his dictation station, his office, and his home outfitted with cameras so that he can keep track of people. And he often would go back to them and have discussions about their conversation. Back when I was starting in hospitals, they encouraged people and families and friends to work together because it stabilized the workforce. Well, in Dr. Fata's office, his turnover was nearly 100% within a year. And 99% of the physicians who were on contract never renewed their contract. So it was just a revolving door. On an interpersonal level, he was fine. He was courteous. He was receptive to courtesy. He empathized with his employees as well as the patients, including me, when they would have challenges. So long as you understood where his borders and his rules began and ended. And mostly they were associated with money. A couple of examples: we had a patient who, in his zeal to come to an appointment, fell in the parking lot. And he hit his head pretty severely and needed to go to the emergency room. He coerced his staff to keep that patient against their wishes and to make sure that that patient got his chemotherapy before he went to the emergency room. He got his chemotherapy, went to the emergency room, but then later died from those wounds. Really, really hit the employees I think, moral codes. And some just decided that was enough, I'm leaving. Some of them just made provisions in their mind and said, you know what? It doesn't affect me, so I'm just gonna do what the doctor told me to do.
I keep saying wow, because it's just, even though I've done a lot of homework in preparing for today, I'm just still shocked by the behavior here. And at some point you thought about leaving, right? You thought about moving on to another practice, and Dr. Fata came and talked to you about staying on board to help him grow the practice. Can you talk about that decision to stay?
So I was getting recruiter calls in my second year there at the practice asking me would I be interested in coming over, because I developed at that time a lot of experience and I could open up a practice and have a waiting list within 40 days. And he needed that skill set. And anybody that he would want to court or had an issue like this, he would take them to, let's say, a Morton Steakhouse or the Ritz. And he took me to a big boy restaurant. And I was staring up at the ceiling, and I recall saying, well, and he said, what's wrong? I said, I didn't realize these places existed anymore, and lucky me. And then he began to talk to me about the practice and what his vision was, that he wanted to open up, a laboratory. He wanted to open up an expanded pharmacy. He wanted to do all kinds of things. He said, I can't do this without you. So what would it take for you to stay? And I told him, well, it's very simple. I want an 8-hour day. I don't want 12-hour days. Number one, I don't have time to do anything at home. Can't have any kind of personal life. And I just wake up and go to sleep thinking about Michigan hematology oncology. And that's not good enough for me. And he said, well, okay. And they decided at that table to cut my hours down. And then he took an envelope and then he pushed it across the table. And I asked him what that was for. And he said, look at it. And it was a check for, like, I don't know, remember $30,000 or $40,000. And I said, what's this? And he said, this is if you'd like to stay. And it'll happen every year. So he gave me a huge raise. And I was already making 6 figures. So I told him that I would. So that's really what happened.
I try to flowchart all the different businesses that Dr. Fata had involved at the end of the day. Looking back on the pharmacy, the practice itself, there was this, it sounded like his own, he was trying to set up his own health system. All kinds of things were playing out during this time. It seemed to, looking back, it seems to be a very ambitious, driven, chaotic sort of thing. But what was it like on the inside?
You could be describing this as the criminal mind meeting with genius. And, if you look at, for example, the continuum of care, and if patients usually begin by seeing their primary care physician, and then they may get testing done, then they may see a specialist, maybe another specialist, and then go into a hospital. At every site of care, there is a report generated, consultation report, a lab testing report. And often those types of reports generate a lot of conversation when they hit Fata's practice, and they're in conflict with his diagnosis. And he would have to, on occasion, have conversations with other providers about the conflict. This patient has cancer. No, he doesn't. Explain. And somehow he always got away with it. He was the greatest liar in the world. I think the devil had no better son than Dr. Fata at that time. He really knew how to lie. And then, so now that you look back and you see this continuum, what would be a good idea to prevent those kind of conversations and lower the risk? And I can understand now in retrospect, if he created these entities, because then he would be the employer or be the CEO of these entities, and therefore can control both the patient through the continuum and also the narrative, so they don't conflict with his diagnosis or his recommendations on that patient. So,
George, in June of 2013, you were encouraged to try to find a doctor to help out with a kind of a slower performing practice that was about an hour outside of Detroit. And if I understand right, it was during this time that your paths crossed with Dr. Mogley. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Well, yes, you're right. Dr. Fata came into my office and took advantage of my skills in recruiting, because that's what I did for the practice. And he asked me to go ahead and recruit for a doctor that already had an office where the patient load didn't even support him. So it was a rural area in Michigan. And that, people don't go to oncologists in the middle of nowhere. They go to the cities. But he put one there, and Dr. Fata asked me to recruit, and I asked if Dr. Mogley was leaving. He said, no. And I said, well, okay. I didn't believe him. So I went to see Dr. Mogley by myself. And I went to his office, and when I went to his office, I asked him if he was leaving. He said, yes. I said, can I ask why? And he pointed up at the ceilings, and he whispered to me, cameras, because the cameras were everywhere, and sometimes you didn't know where they were. And then we went to a resource library where there are no cameras and microphones. And there he told me that the reason he was leaving and some of the other mid-level practitioners were because Dr. Fata was providing chemotherapy without need, that he was taking patients off of hospice, or he was giving people chemotherapy really into the last day of life. And he said that he already found a job. He's leaving the practice. And he said, you should leave if you can. And at the time, I thought that was a ridiculous statement. I thought it was more likely, since the people that were also leaving was mid-level practitioners, nurse practitioners and PAs, that he wanted to get out of his contract and start his own practice. And so I didn't give it any attention. But I think remembering all of, you could say red flags over the time that I had been there, I had thought maybe he has something there. So let me conduct my own investigation. It sounded very serious. If this was true, then I had to do something about it. So I contacted David Heron, which is my attorney, and I had a client relationship with him in the past where I handled a whistleblower case successfully. And I talked to him and I said, well, I told him what I had, and he said, well, it sounds serious. I appreciate the call, but from your previous whistleblower case that you have to have strong proof. And I'm not sure it rises to the level of strong proof yet. So what I would suggest that you do is sit back and see, what you run into. And if there's, more solid proof, then give us a call, and then we'll talk about it. So I began to look at other things that I saw every day, and I couldn't go into the medical records because that would then trigger Dr. Fata asking as to why his practice manager or his office manager that walks around with the keys in his hand instead of a stethoscope is going into medical records. And he's always concerned and paranoid to some degree. So I decided not to go there. And I figured that I needed to look at things that I saw every day. So I looked at the patient consultation to treatment ratio. And I found with the other doctors, maybe 30% of the patients who saw the doctors in consultation would actually get some form of treatment. But with Dr. Fata, nearly every patient that he saw was getting treatment. And I'm sure that somehow could be explained, but it was a red flag. And I said, you know what? Who could probably explain it more? I'll see Dr. Mogley again. So I went to see him one more time. And I told him that your information took me aback. And I was wondering if you could share with me or elaborate on what you just told me a couple of weeks ago. And he said, you want proof? And I said, yes, I do. So he pulled out his cell phone and he flipped it and he showed me all the patients that had been disfigured by intense chemotherapy. He said he wasn't just aggressive. He hurt them. And he said that, and I told him, well, give me the pictures and if you can, the names of those patients. And he said he wouldn't. And I said, why? And he said, because if he found out what I was doing or what I did do back at the time that I saw this stuff, and I wouldn't get my recommendation, I wouldn't be able to get that job in Ohio. In fact, if he sued me, that would be the end of my career. I don't have the resources to fight this man. And we went back and forth. I still pressed him until finally I asked him, well, if you won't give me the names of the patients, give me the drugs he was using. He said, there's way too many drugs. I said, well, okay, give me one drug. And he gave me the name of a drug called IVIG. And then I took it. And now as I was leaving, he said, George, think about this. You are just an office manager. That means you have no medical experience. And you could deny ever having known this. But if you learn all this stuff, what you know, you'll be responsible for. You can't later say you didn't know this. So if I'm advising you just to end this, and then I took the information on the IVIG and I left his office. And then I continued my investigation by speaking to two other nurses. And that's how I discovered him.
So, George, a lot of people across the country probably are in your shoes, right? They're seeing things that are happening. They feel like, you know what, I can't go against this doctor who has all these resources and has a medical degree, and they don't do anything, or they move on like so many others. But you didn't. You decided to push the issue. Why did you decide to do that?
First of all, to some degree, Dr. Munglay's statement is right. It's like opening up Pandora's box. You know, once you open it up, you have to face the consequences of what's inside. Second, I had a family member who had cancer. And I certainly wouldn't want people to walk away from something that they knew could have saved her. And I did not think if he was doing this and walk away from this and have a clean conscience. Basically, what I did is that I saw a need and a critical need. And I said, there's no way out of this. I have to move forward.
So, Dave, I'm really glad you're joining us. This touches on something I think that's really important. There's this reluctance in the medical community, specifically not wanting to blow the whistle against another physician. They just move on, right? There's this line that a lot of them don't want to cross. Why do you think that is?
It's the same thing, I think, in most professions. As attorneys, we have an obligation to report another attorney who is violating ethical principles. And there's a thin blue line that we've seen recently in police practices where unnecessary force is used and fellow officers don't want to report them. But there comes a point where people are dying, literally. People are being disfigured, like in this case, that most of our clients that come to us says in that kind of a case, couldn't sleep at night. Others, like the doctor that George spoke to, are concerned about financial considerations. I go away, somebody will catch them or them, but I've got a family. And I think that's probably the case across the country.
So, David, in this particular case, when George reached out to you, both the first time and I guess after doing a little more investigation, what was your reaction?
It was shocking, I think. I've handled these cases, this type of case like Dr. Fata's for well over 25 years. And I don't think I've seen any where the direct harm to the patient is shown. Performing unnecessary services in Medicare context obtains more money, but the services are performed. Right. Taking an extra EKG or something when it's not necessary, Medicare pays for it, but the services are performed. Every procedure has certain consequences, but this can't think of anything worse. The worst diagnosis I think you can get is that you have cancer, and what it does to your family and what it does to you and your future, whatever age you are. think about being told you have cancer and you don't have it. And it's a lie. And I've talked to a number of the patients that were victims of Dr. Fata after we exposed him and it became public. And it destroyed their lives, not only physically, but emotionally. And then when he was convicted, pled guilty, they went to another physician, and the physician came back and said, you never had cancer. And they've lost their teeth. They lost the use of their various organs. They were disfigured. And that was as bad as finding out in the beginning that they thought they had cancer. This was, if somebody tells you your doctor charged for your examination and charged at a higher level than he or she actually performed, it means we'll all pay more money. Medicare paid a lot of money, but they performed the exam.
Mm-hmm.
But when they gave you chemo for weeks and weeks, you were poisoned, just under the level to kill you in most cases. I don't think I've seen it in 25 years, that kind of a case. There's a couple, but not many. Opiates are a similar one. Overprescribing opiates as pain medication. But that's the line we're facing.
These cases, talking about False Claims Act cases in general, tend to take a long, long time. But the timeline on this one was pretty short. The government seemed to really try to move quickly here. On August 2nd, 2013, you went and met with a lot of people from a lot of different agencies at a relators meeting, right, George? Can you talk about that meeting when you walked in the room and there's the alphabet soup of agencies represented at the table, what that meeting was like?
From an emotional perspective, and then also from, a practical, in terms of who was there and what they did. I can tell you, I went to an amusement park and gone to a ride called the Demon Drop. And, it's like a roller coaster, except they hung you from what would be the equivalent of a dumpster. And that anticipation of falling is essentially what I was feeling just before going into that room, because normally you would have, and I had in the past, one U.S. assistant attorney, maybe one person from Health and Human Resources if they could find him, or the Federal Bureau of Investigation. But then in my case, there was a conference room filled with people from all departments in the Department of Justice. I'm talking about Health and Human Services, criminal, civil side. You are talking about the local jurisdiction, and also from Washington on the criminal side, perhaps the Internal Revenue Service, the state of Michigan, and all of their investigators. I'm talking about from the different departments. And it felt more like an interrogation rather than an interview, because they had stacks of medical records in front of them. How they got them, I'll never know. And they kept on talking about why this patient got 155 chemotherapy treatments. And I said, well, I thought you just heard, you knew what I did there. I fixed computers and made sure the IT worked. And, I didn't administer. I had nothing to do with the medical staff, but I am communicating what happened. So then at the end of the meeting, which lasted like 3 hours or 4 hours long, they asked me to provide them with anyone that could corroborate this information. And then I gave them a list of 8 names, roughly. And these are people that provided red flags to me in the past. I'm not sure if they still remembered, like, we shouldn't have given this injection, or I'm not comfortable with this care plan. It's kind of something you would expect the normal discussion, but it took on new meaning in the light of an investigation on my part. So I gave them the 8 names, and then based on that, they conducted simultaneous interviews between the information I gave them on the finance, the medical record, and the statements I made about what he was doing, and the interviews. They were able to see the judge and execute search warrants and, decided that we're going to arrest Fata. That was intense insofar that it just didn't end there. We worked all weekend exchanging information about the practice, what Fata did, when he did it. Could you tell me about the different clinics? I gave them schematic drawings of all the clinics with the keys because they had decided to do a raid, but they wanted that information before they went in. So I gave them a lot of information, but that meeting was probably the most intense myself or pretty much anybody, because I don't imagine you'd go into court and experience that kind of scrutiny. But I came out of it, so here it is.
This is really remarkable for people who have been longtime viewers and watchers of the show. You've heard about cases involving drugs made by GSK that were defective, and then it took the government years to ultimately move on some of these allegations. You've heard about Enron. You've heard about all these different cases and matters and fraud allegations in which the government listened to the whistleblower, and then a long time transpired before the government ultimately moved on a search warrant or an arrest warrant. This was a weekend, right? Dave, you guys met on August 2nd, and then on August 6th, Fata's in handcuffs. They're raiding the facilities, and computers are being wheeled out the side doors. Why did they move so quickly here?
Someday I'll figure it out. But I talked to Peter Kaplan, the chief of civil, on Wednesday. He asked us to meet on Thursday. And George was working. He didn't want to raise any alarms. So we said, okay, he's got time. We met on Friday morning. And in the room, I've been in rooms with a lot of agents, but there was an alphabet. And we left it at noon, and they said, okay, we're going to meet some more. That afternoon, they grabbed his billing records, which were down south. They got a search warrant, and they started interviewing these people that George talked to, worked with George all weekend. We were working, drafting the complaint, which never happens in 3 days. And they even got his keys so they could execute a search warrant at every office, and told us that they were going to execute a search warrant, which is also unusual, Tuesday morning, just over the weekend at his offices. So a couple things. Number one, we finished the complaint over the weekend, filed it at 9:30 Monday morning. That afternoon, they issued a complaint and arrested Fata as he was leaving his house. And Tuesday morning, got agents from everywhere, Border Patrol, ICE, and hit every one of his offices. And that was it. He was in jail from that moment on a $9 million bond that he tried to get lowered and never did.
So, George, I'm guessing you won an Oscar that day, walking into the office as they're raiding your employer.
Well, it's true. I got called in and said, well, we're ready for you. And so here I'm driving, not knowing what to anticipate once I got there. And what I saw was nearly the entire staff, particularly their nurses, all sequestered in the parking lot. And I parked the car, got out of the car, and one of them came to me and said, do you know what's going on here? And of course, I couldn't say anything because of the seal. I said, no, what's going on? And they said, you can't tell me. You don't know what's going on. And I said, you're right. I can't tell you what's going on. And just then, one of the agents came out the front door of the facility and then waved over me and said, George, over here. She goes, they're not going to let you in. And I said, well, maybe. And then, of course, I went in with him. And then you heard this big sigh where all the staff was going, yeah, he's in on it. He's in on it. And I was thinking to myself, do you remember that first day you walked in here, your first day at work? Could you ever have imagined this would be your last? I went into the doorway and I saw this big sign on the reception desk, and it covered the glass window saying, Fata's innocent, let him go. It was almost like a campaign sign or something. And Samar Fata had asked one of the staff to put it up. I thought it was distasteful, but that they were absorbed. And
Wow.
patients were coming in and they were being triaged back to the hospitals and back to other clinics. And the place was in shambles. No medical records whatsoever, paper medical records. Some of the computer had been imaged. Others had been taken out. The ceiling panels were down. And the microphones that Dr. Fata installed were hanging like Christmas tree lights on a house all over the place. And then Samar Fata came walking in. And this was really, really took me back, because I thought, given her relationship with both the clinic and Dr. Fata, that she would be gone too, but she wasn't. So she came into my office and closed the door and said, I want you to tell me what you said to the FBI. And I told her, because of the seal, I couldn't say anything. And she goes, well, maybe if you just go outside and talk to one of the agents, they'll tell you if I said anything. And she'll say, no, I want to hear it from you. And I said, well, nothing. I can't give you any information. Sorry. And she goes, well, in that case, there's no work for you here then. And then she fired me. And then I went home.
Of course, it doesn't end there, right? You continue assisting the government going forward. And now Dr. Fata is not only not seeing patients anymore, but it's not seeing the outside world. Can you talk about what role you played in assisting the government after this day? A lot of people view whistleblowers as filing a case and then nothing happens. But certainly Dave knows this, you know this, and we know this. You play an active role in assisting the case, building the case going forward, right?
We assisted them with information mostly, which they used to hire external experts to look at Dr. Fata's encounters with patients and decide, well, was he acting aggressively or did he cross the line? And then on that basis, they discovered it was more than just medical malpractice. There was intent here that they could document. We helped them with financial information about where certain investments were located, certain records were located, because apparently he had a secret room in his home where he kept medical records. This was truly Machiavelli, that, the stuff that you really can't make up unless it appeared in a movie. And I can't remember all of the things, but I can tell you that there wasn't a month that went by without our being contacted by someone. And that's not counting the media.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. No, that's very telling. So, Dave, what do you think the lasting legacy of this case is?
Everybody in situations like this tends to see problems. If they are repetitive, take notes, ask questions, especially if people are getting hurt, do something about it. There's always somebody you can tell. If it's an attorney, people worry about giving records and the like. HIPAA has a specific protection for that. And it'll cost you something. It may cost you your job, but if you see somebody being hurt, somebody being injured, financially or physically, you have to say something. That's the lesson. And George investigated. He did the right thing. He came to us. We went to the government, and the government listens. If you do it the right way, if you don't identify, if you don't call anonymously, which is okay, but there's a lot of people that do that, and there's only so much the False Claims Act imposes the obligation to look at it. And so a lot of people are living because of him. I guess that's a legacy.
So, George, I always ask this question, but I think it's really going to ring true for people listening to you. People that are in your shoes, where you were in 2013, who are starting to recognize that their employer is doing things the wrong way and potentially hurting people. A lot of people move on, but you decided to do something. What do you say to that person who's in your shoes where you were in 2013?
First of all, I think it's very case specific. I think that forget about the moral question. The government will end up finding out what's going on, and they'll probably ask you the question, if not now, later. So you better come forward with this information. That's number one. Second, you're like looking at this information and deciding what the consequences might be. Now, you could go on a website and turn it in, but the chances are that you're going to have follow-up or participate in the investigation is probably very small. That's why I say go to an experienced whistleblower attorney, at least have that conversation. You don't have to file, because an experienced whistleblower attorney with ideally a relationship with a local Department of Justice will have all the information they need to give you and advise you how to distill the information. They'll deal with whether or not your information rises to the level of a whistleblower case, or it's something that you need to talk to someone else about, the state or the medical board or someone else. They may look at this and say, what your consequences if you decide to go forward are. And in my particular case, the consequences were deep. You'd lose your job, perhaps you'd lose your career, just like Dr. Mungale didn't want to go forward with it because he needed his references and he needed Dr. Fata's references, and he would destroy him financially. So he decided he's not going to do anything about it. The whistleblower attorney will then advise you what's your best course of action, and then have the capability based on what you tell him and the information you give him to either go forward, get the process going, file your claim, and then deal with all of the other entities that may be involved. Because given the seriousness of this case, it was called the most egregious case in U.S. history, that he's going to also deal with not just the legal issues, but the Department of Justice, the FBI agents, the media, which is a lot of work and a lot of hardship. And he's going to filter all that and give you options as to what you need to do at this point. I think that's important, because I think I used to get a call like every day for the first week when the case was unsealed. It just continued for, like, as you noted, about 10 years. And that's something you never expect, but you also don't expect to deal with it on your own. Having a whistleblower attorney prevents that. You shouldn't be on your own in something like this. So that would be my advice, is to seek at least a conversation with an experienced whistleblower attorney.
Jeb, one last thing. George and I had a lot to do. Obviously, we were the impetus for this case, but the Justice Department and those people that were involved, Barbara McQuaid, the then U.S. Attorney, Peter Kaplan, the Chief of Civil, Sarah Cohn at the Criminal Division, Joan Hartman, who was then strong, others. I could go on forever. We're on it constantly calling us, constantly talking to us. The Department of Justice has gotten some bad rap in the last 4 or 5 years for, major things and media attention and the like, but they were amazing. This is what the false claims, the partnership, can save a lot of lives. So I commend them, and it's great working with them, but this one highlights everything you've talked about, Taxpayers Against Fraud, about the partnership.
Well, Dave, I appreciate you. I want to acknowledge you for everything you've done for the organization over the years, and I certainly appreciate you helping us put this program together. Providing a megaphone and a spotlight for these stories is so important, and your support was invaluable to making sure that happens. And George, I just want to acknowledge you for everything that you did and for continuing to share your story. A lot of people go on with their lives, but I think the stories that you continue to tell about what you went through will inspire other people to step forward in your shoes. And I just want to acknowledge you for that today. Next week, you're going to want to join us for the next episode of Fraud in America. We hope you enjoyed today's episode of Fraud in America. Today's episode was made possible because of the generous donation of longtime TAF supporter and whistleblower attorney David L. Herron. If you believe you have witnessed fraud against the government or fraud on the financial markets, we encourage you to visit our website at taf.org, where you will find a directory of member attorneys who represent whistleblowers across the country. On our website, you will also find additional information about our nation's various whistleblower laws and programs and a way to donate to our organization as we step forward in spreading information about whistleblower programs. This episode was edited and produced by Rachel Brooks, and our theme song is by Connor Chaos. A big thank you to our TAF staff and researchers of James King, Emma Bass, Jackie DeMar, Kate Scanlon, Max Boldman. Fraud in America is a project of Taxpayers Against Fraud Education Fund. The opinions expressed on today's show belong solely to the guest and are not necessarily endorsed by the organization. Thank you for joining us on today's episode of Fraud in America.